Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk about a method that I've been thinking through and trying to incorporate in my life. It's a method that I discuss in my first full-length treatise called Confusion, and the method is called Open-Minded Subjectivism. You're probably wondering what open-minded subjectivism is. Well, indeed, it's a method. It's a method of thinking through ideas. More specifically, it's a way of thinking critically about certain ideas and about certain concepts and about certain arguments in general. And it's a method that's supposed to simplify the way that we view life and simplify how we go about making our decisions and how we go through life. So, the idea behind open minded subjectivism is essentially to figure out the role of objectivity, which would include facts or um, which would include facts as well as more external things such as ideas that we might find offensive, and that's to figure out the role between those kinds of things with our own subjectivity, which would include our beliefs. So, open minded subjectivism, I might have my own spin on what that means, but other people have put it into other terms. One way of looking at it is sticking to our guns and yet being open. That's one way that we could look at open minded subjectivism. So, it's the clash between both of those philosophies. So, now here's the problem. Open-minded subjectivism is itself a subjective approach. So that's one of the reasons why I'm talking about it, because it doesn't seem to be as obvious as it would seem. I mean, the theory makes sense and it might seem obvious, but it's not as obvious as I think, because we all have different philosophies. We all have different ways of thinking about things. And that's why, again, I consider open-minded subjectivism to be a method. So again, this is an approach to living life and thinking logically while still staying true to ourselves. And so I think that's crucial, because I think that essentially what we want to do is we want to try to find some kind of balance between our subjectivity and what we believe and what we want to do and how we think, and yet also trying to take in everything from the outside. Anything that's external, whether it's an idea that we find offensive or a certain fact that doesn't jive with our own understanding of life, and stuff like that. And so that's really important. So there are many ways of thinking about things, and that is the importance of our subjectivity. So I often like to use the metaphor in terms of thinking about open-minded subjectivism. I often use the metaphor of a book. So when we read a book, we don't want to look at it objectively per se, right? We want to look at the book subjectively. We want to look at the book in terms of how it gives our lives meaning, not how it gives somebody else's lives meaning. I mean, we might want to look into that, but for the most part, when we're reading a book, because it's such a personal thing, we need to be able to look at it from our unique subjective perspective. And so essentially, I use the idea of a literary text as a metaphor for life. And so we want to be able to look at life from our subjective viewpoint. And so I really like that metaphor and I think that it definitely describes what I mean by subjectivity. Indeed, I do believe that truth can be found internally. I think there's a reason why we want to stick to our guns. I think there's a reason why we believe certain things. And I think that we definitely need to be true to that. Um, I think that even with external factors clashing with our subjectivity, I think that our subjectivity still holds credence and can still be truthful, even with the things that clash against the way we think, our subjective understanding of life, and the like. So, yeah, so, but that's the thing. Um, we also need the open minded part. So, if we start with the idea that we need our subjectivity because it can give us truth, that indeed truth can be found internally, well, what's the open minded part of this phrase, open minded subjectivism? Well, it'd be exactly what it sounds like. It's where we're open to other ideas. It's where we're open to external facts, we're open to external details, we're open to external perspectives. Even if we have our own grounding in our subjective opinions and our subjective thoughts and our subjective arguments and the like, we still try to take into account all of the exterior things that exist. And so essentially, we try to be open minded. We try to incorporate the uncomfortable external things, external elements, external facts, and the like. So there's many ideas that we might encounter every day that make us uncomfortable, but if we were being open-minded about it, then of course we would at least think about it. The subjectivism part comes in when we critique it, which I'll get into in a minute. But for the most part, we would at least try to be open to the idea as much as we can, even if it causes revulsion or it makes us uncomfortable. So a good example would be if we don't approve of homosexuals, we would still try to be open to a homosexual couple that we see, and open to their lifestyle, and even try to appreciate it and understand their perspective. And so it's a way of integrating, and that's just as an example, but it's a way of integrating our own subjectivity with the outside world and taking into account other perspectives. And that's just as an example. I mean, there's a lot of things that would make us uncomfortable. Religious beliefs make us uncomfortable, certain religious beliefs. So if you're atheist, then when you start hearing a Christian talking about Jesus, then naturally you're also going to feel some antagonism, some natural antagonism. It's going to clash very heavily with your subjectivity. But if you were using open-minded subjectivism, you would do your best to try to incorporate as much as you can from what that Christian is saying into your own belief systems while still keeping your subjectivity intact. So this is kind of my idea behind objectivity or open-mindedness. It's the idea to use objectivity to challenge your philosophy and to incorporate new information. And so essentially, your philosophy, so when I describe a philosophy, I'm basically describing everything that incorporates your subjectivity. So your beliefs, your ideas, your motivations, the way that you think, your thought process, all of that. Anything that has to do with your subjective viewpoint. Essentially what you do is you try to use objective facts as well as the external things that exist to challenge your own philosophy of life and your own philosophy in general, which would be your subjectivity. And I think that that's super crucial. So, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because it seems that, so when I talk about how, we have a certain philosophy that we incorporate, the problem is sometimes that philosophy and this set of beliefs can be so set that we're never open. We're just completely closed-minded, and we're never open to anything, to any outside experience, any new facts, new information, and the like. And this can be very problematic. Real fast, there's a brief argument that pretty much describes how certain communities or certain people can be polarized in their thinking. And so the issue is that what they do is they're not very good at taking in new information. What they do instead is they take information that fits their own philosophy and they discard the rest, anything that would contradict it. And that is essentially irrational. There might be good reasons why we would do that, but it's irrational because we're not taking new information. And my theory of open-minded subjectivism wants to challenge that idea. Another way that open-minded subjectivism can be useful, as I've kind of implied, is that we can use it to try to reason through things that we find offensive. So we're always going to find things that we find offensive, and sometimes we need to find those things offensive. Sometimes they are indeed morally wrong. I definitely don't want to argue for a relativist moral perspective per se. But I do think that sometimes we overreact on things that we consider offensive, and sometimes those things aren't even offensive. We just consider them offensive, even though from an objective perspective they might not be. And so the idea is just to reason through it. So I'm not saying just go out and read a whole bunch of rated R books, but at least try to be open to a rated R book and see how you can incorporate its ideas more into your life. And if you can't, then you would reject it, and that's where subjectivity would come into play. But for the most part, to try to be open to it. So essentially, subjective impulses clash with the external, as I've implied, clash with this kind of objectivity. But this viewpoint of open-minded subjectivism is a good synthesis of the two. Because we need our subjective truths, but we also need the outside world to challenge those subjective truths and to essentially keep us in check, and to keep us honest with our ideas and how we think about things, and to always push us past our boundaries and our limitations. I also think that in general, open-minded subjectivism is a good method for evaluating ideas. I think it's a good method because open-minded subjectivism is a way of thinking critically. So we approach certain issues from our subjectivity, but we also do what we can to incorporate new ideas, the new ideas that are around us, and so that forms an interesting synthesis of ideas. And it's a certain kind of critical thinking. Now, what I want to say is, when the open-minded part of this open-minded subjectivism, while it's good to be open, I would of course advise you to not be open to everything, because I think that being open to everything can be just as dangerous as being open to nothing. I do think that there's a reason why I do put emphasis on the subjective elements, is because I think that, again, truth can be found internally. The whole point of clashing with the external is to challenge our notions, to push us out of our comfort zone, and to challenge and to prevent us from just staying stuck in a box and stagnant in our thought. But essentially, we still have to be careful when we don't want to just be open to everything, because that can be dangerous. It can open us up to a lot of problems, as you can probably imagine. So ideally, what I see happening with open-minded subjectivism is the idea that essentially the subjective ego doesn't overtake you, but it still holds prevalence. So we all have beliefs, and we all have a right to stick with those beliefs, but we shouldn't stick with those beliefs so much that it's all about our subjective ego, and it's all about proving that right. And it's not, so essentially open-minded subjectivism is to prevent the attitude that we're always right, but it's also used to kind of insulate the things that we find internally true to be right from too much clashing and too much believing that it's wrong and too much doubt. Because if you have too much doubt about your beliefs, then that can be a really scary place to be. I'm just checking the time. I have a couple minutes and I'm almost done. So, as I said before, this isn't as obvious as it seems, because people do have extreme ideologies and they can be very closed-minded, and we essentially have to keep that in mind, that the reason why I'm proposing this theory of open-minded subjectivism is because I want to encourage people to try to be less closed-minded, and I want to encourage them to not be so extreme in their ideologies, and to try to be open-minded to everything that's happening around them, and more specifically open-minded to other perspectives, because I think that being open to other perspectives helps reduce conflict, which I think can be very good for society. And so I would definitely say also that this theory is important, this method is important for going about things, because we want to make sure that we don't spin specific narratives. So in history there's this idea where history is always written from the perspective of the winner, with the exception of maybe postmodern history, but it's always written from the perspective of the winner, and that is a way of writing a specific narrative, and that's exactly what open-minded subjectivism wants to avoid. Now, closing, I just want to say that open-minded subjectivism is merely a method. It is merely a way of thinking critically, and merely a way of thinking through problems and ideas and objective facts and the like. It's a way of using rationality. But just be aware that I don't see it as the truth with a capital T. I just see it as a method, even though I think that it's very useful and it's been useful in my life, and it could potentially be useful in your life. You may even already adopt this in your own way. I think that it is not the truth, because everybody has their own philosophy and different ways of going about things, and we must keep that in mind. In fact, that is exactly what open-minded subjectivism would require by definition, is that we're consistently open to other philosophies, even if they might be extreme or closed-minded, or even just something we disagree with, and we have to be as open to it as possible. Again, this is Phoenix, and thank you.